This story happened to me not long ago, and to this day, I still can't fully understand what it was. Was it something supernatural? A hallucination from my injury? Or something even stranger? Sometimes I even wonder, am I still alive? Or am I already dead? But one thing I know for sure, it was something terrifying, unexplainable, and it changed my life forever. I spent most of my 20s working construction sites until tragedy struck. I never had enough knowledge to go to engineering school like my parents wanted, but I enjoyed working with my hands anyway. Jobs came and went, contracts ended, but I always found another site or building to work on. When Blackthorn Industries offered me a foreman position for the construction of their new corporate headquarters, I agreed without hesitation. A guaranteed job at such a big firm, a salary I could only dream of, and all the benefits that came with it. It would have been stupid to say no. The foundation had just been poured when the collapse happened. No one could figure out the cause, whether it was a surveying error, an engineering miscalculation, or just bad luck. But those of us who were buried under the rubble blamed the company first. 3 dead, 10 injured. That was enough for Blackthorn Industries to offer us generous settlements and handle the matter out of court. You can judge me for selling out, but if you were handed a check with 6 zeros, you'd probably take it too. On top of that, they offered me a remote position I could do from home and a place in one of their residential complexes at a discounted rent. The apartment was wheelchair accessible, which was now my reality for the rest of my life. I hadn't even known they owned residential buildings, but the brochure made it look decent enough. Either way, staying in my old 5th-floor apartment wasn't an option anymore. I moved in at the beginning of March last year. I won't lie, adjusting to everything at once was harder than I expected. Overnight, I went from a guy who worked outdoors every day to someone stuck in a wheelchair, confined to the indoors. Instead of a hard hat and work boots, I now had a laptop and stacks of paperwork. The depression from the whole situation only got worse once I settled into the new apartment. I was ashamed to realize how little I had left in my life that still made sense after the accident. The move didn't take long. Just a day after being discharged from the hospital, I was already in my new place. The apartment was on the ground floor, for obvious reasons. The 2nd and 3rd floors had balconies that hung over my small, fenced-in courtyard, blocking most of the sunlight from my already small living room windows. Next to the living room was a kitchen with lowered countertops and extra shelves. The bedroom was spacious, with a wheelchair-accessible closet and a large attached bathroom. I wish I could say I felt grateful, but these accommodations only reminded me that my old life was gone forever. Don't get me wrong, I'm not one of those people who think disability makes someone lesser. I had an aunt who spent her whole life in a wheelchair and an older brother with special needs. I always respected them. But both of them died because they depended on things they couldn't get. My aunt, in her old age, fell out of her wheelchair at home and couldn't get up or reach the phone. The medics said her pets started eating her while she was still alive. My brother took his own life because my parents refused to give him the support he needed. I still don't speak to my family because of it. And now, after almost 30 years of independence, I found myself completely dependent on the company that had put me in this situation. To say I was furious would be an understatement. That June, there was an unusual heat wave. By then, I had settled into a bleak routine. Wake up, do some arm exercises, shower, have breakfast, and then try to work until lunch. What I was doing could barely be called work, but I guess it was cheaper for the company to keep me on an NDA and payroll than risk another lawsuit. After lunch, I'd check my fridge and add groceries to a mobile order for anything that was running low. It was easier than trying to get to the store myself. I rarely left the apartment and avoided people, so there was no reason to go outside. The only voices I heard for months were my neighbors. From the sounds of it, the couple above me argued constantly, and next door lived an elderly woman with more cats than the lease allowed. One day in mid-June, I stepped out of the shower and was drying my hair with a towel when I noticed the power had gone out in the apartment. It was inevitable. With the heat wave, everyone's air conditioners were running at full blast. I finished drying off and, for the first time since moving in, wheeled myself to the sliding door, leading to my small courtyard to flip the breakers in the electrical panel. Outside, it was hot and humid, and as I looked at the grass beneath my feet, which I could no longer feel, I noticed how quiet it was, without the hum of the AC units. No birds, no insects. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the morning sun hit my face until it disappeared behind the balcony above. In that brief moment of silence, I felt a strange sense of peace. The silence was broken by the sound of a sliding door opening on the floor above. There was the creak of floorboards, footsteps, and the familiar voices I'd heard so many times before. "If you don't want to fix it, then I'll do it myself," came a woman's voice. "I didn't say I wouldn't do it," replied what I assumed was her husband. "Just give me a second to put my shoes on. Why do you always—" I tuned out the rest of their argument. The peace, it seemed, was fleeting. I opened the panel and flipped the switches. Outside, my AC unit roared to life, drowning out the yelling from above. As I struggled to wheel myself back over the threshold of the sliding door, the voices upstairs went quiet, followed by the sound of the door sliding shut and locking. I managed to get back inside, hoping I wouldn't have to go out again anytime soon. I'm ashamed to admit it, but that was the last time I went outside, for months. I hadn't spoken to my family in years, and I had almost no friends left, the few I had lived in other states. So there was no reason to go anywhere. The heat and my depression only made me more reclusive. Wake up, shower, eat breakfast, work all day, sleep. Even the constant arguing from upstairs and the occasional meowing from the apartment next door became background noise. I learned to tune it out, the same thing day after day, the same voices, the same fights, the same cats. But sometimes I couldn't help but listen. The woman above me, I think her name was Claire, seemed to be unemployed. She only ever spoke to scold her husband or complain. Her husband, Jason, I never quite caught his name, was quick to snap back. He was more defensive than aggressive, but it only fueled their constant bickering. A cold, detached man with a volatile, sensitive wife. What could be worse? The neighbor to my right, an elderly woman with cats, never told me her name, but I remembered the names of her pets perfectly: Greta, Priscilla, and Tom. Every day she'd beg Tom to stop meowing for food, and by lunchtime She'd scold Greta and Priscilla for fighting over a spot in the sunbeam. Whenever I heard about that sunbeam, I felt a pang of bitterness at how little light made it into my own apartment. Those voices were my only connection to the outside world. In mid-September, as I tried to clear my throat from worsening allergies, I suddenly realized I hadn't heard my own voice in months. That night, I broke down crying, feeling lonelier than ever. By October, the isolation had become unbearable. I started listening to those voices even more intently, silencing any noise in my apartment just to make out their conversations. The same arguments, complaints, meows. They became a strange kind of comfort. Then, one night, driven by either desperation or a need for some kind of entertainment, I started talking back. At first, it was just whispers, barely audible even to me. When I heard Claire hiss at her husband, "You never listen to me," I'd whisper back, "I'm listening." When her husband, Jackson, snapped, "God, I can't do this anymore," I'd chuckle softly and whisper, "Me neither." I don't know why I did it. Maybe to hear my own voice. Maybe to feel some faint semblance of connection. It was stupid, illogical, but it made my life feel less empty. Gradually, it turned into a kind of game. At night, sitting in the dim light of my apartment and drinking too much, I'd listen to them and respond, like we were having a conversation. When Claire shouted, "You don't value me at all," I'd whisper, "That's not true." And when the old lady scolded Tom for knocking something over, I'd smirk, "Bad cat." It wasn't exactly a game. It was all I had left. But a week after I started doing this, I noticed something for the first time. Claire yelled, "Just once, admit that I might be right." And, without thinking, I whispered back, "Why should I, if you're wrong?" Before I could even finish, her husband's voice came from upstairs, directed at her. "Why should I, if you're wrong?" I froze. I sat there for a minute, waiting to hear more. It felt like I'd heard this before. Maybe they'd argued about this before. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. They probably fought about the same things over and over. And after weeks of listening, maybe I'd just started predicting their lines subconsciously. But the next day, it happened again. Claire repeated, "Is it really that hard to renew the registration for my car? It's been expired for a week." I distinctly remembered her saying the exact same thing back in August, and now it was October. What week? It had been over 2 months. I turned off the AC and listened even more intently. My heart was pounding, as if trying to break through my ribs. "If it's no big deal, why don't you just go and do it yourself?" Her voice came again. I swallowed, my throat dry, and my palms slick with cold sweat. I was certain I'd heard this before, word for word, with the same tone. I tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. The next night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds from above. I tried to convince myself I was just overthinking it, but the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't go away. In the morning, I decided to keep detailed notes on my computer about everything I heard. I hadn't paid much attention to the specifics before, but now I was determined to record everything. I turned off all possible sources of noise, the fan, the washing machine, even skipped my shower just to hear and document everything clearly. 8:15. Neighbor to the right. Old lady. Oh, Tommy Tom, quiet down. I already fed you. 8:17. From upstairs, Claire on the phone. Yes, he's gone to work. No, I'm alone here until his lunch break. 12:32. Again from upstairs. Jason, I told you not to slam the front door when you come in. You scare me every time. I spent the whole day trying to record every distinguishable word. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual to compare the notes. I waited for the neighbors to show signs of life. And sure enough, at 8:15, from the apartment next door, oh, Tommy Tom, quiet down, I already fed you. At 8:17, yes, he's gone to work. No, I'm alone here until his lunch break. And so on until 12:32, when Claire complained about the door slamming again. Except I knew for a fact that the door hadn't slammed once. Everything repeated word for word, minute by minute. It was as if someone was playing a pre-recorded track, quiet enough that I hadn't noticed its precision before. I was genuinely scared. I needed fresh air, and I decided to do something I hadn't done in months. I left the apartment. I slowly wheeled myself into the courtyard. The sun was blinding, and the light breeze felt almost surreal after so many months indoors. The building formed a neat U-shape with an identical mirrored building across from it. The balconies of the second and third floors loomed above me like gray concrete ledges. I looked up at the windows of the apartment above mine. The curtains were wide open, but there was no movement inside. I turned to the window of the old lady with the cats. Same picture. Open curtains, no movement. Then I noticed it. Every window in our building and the one across from it was the same. Open curtains, complete stillness. I sat in the courtyard for almost an hour, staring and waiting for any sign of life. Not a single silhouette, no creaking doors, no one entering or exiting the building. The silence pressed down on me. I suddenly realized that in all these 8 months, I had never actually seen a single neighbor in person. Not once. Not in the parking lot, not on the stairs, not on the balconies, even though I'd heard them there countless times. Even when I moved in, I hadn't seen any staff. Everything was done online, and I was brought here by a company car while the movers had already taken care of everything. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. I had lived here for 8 months, never seeing my neighbors, even though I constantly heard their voices. As soon as I realized this, the curtains in the apartment to my right suddenly closed. A few seconds later, the curtains in the apartment above mine also shut. It was like a wave passed through the entire complex. One by one, all the open curtains dropped, hiding from my view. I wheeled myself faster than ever, heading out of the courtyard toward the parking lot. Surely there had to be a management office or something like that here. But as I reached the parking lot, all I saw were endless rows of identical buildings, and in every window, the curtains were suddenly closing. It seemed to stretch on for block after block. I had no idea the complex was this massive. I wheeled around the area for about 20 minutes, trying to find any building that looked like an office. But there was nothing. Just identical houses, empty parking lots, parked cars, bicycles, abandoned children's furniture on porches, toys on the pathways as if they'd been left there just minutes ago. All the signs of normal life, but without the life itself. Finally, I returned home, exhausted. My arms burned from the effort, and I couldn't go any further. The moment I got back into my apartment and closed the doorbell rang. The second the door clicked shut, someone pressed the bell. I immediately opened it again, but no one was there, just my grocery order neatly placed on the mat, even though there had been nothing there a second ago. The following days all seemed to blur into one. If anyone had been watching from the outside, they would have seen me constantly darting from window to window, peeking through the gap in the curtains like a junkie waiting for a fix. The neighbors' arguments and complaints about the cats stopped completely for about a week. It felt like it, whatever it was, had sensed my suspicion and taken a break. But when the voices returned a week later, they were different. New complaints, new conflicts, even a supposedly new cat at the old lady's place. On the second day of the voices' return, I noticed they changed again the next day, and the day after that was different too. I started to hope that maybe it was all just my paranoia. I even heard cars passing by from time to time. Maybe they'd always been there, and I just hadn't noticed. But on the 8th day, everything fell into place. Old phrases, conflicts, and conversations I'd recorded started repeating. I also realized that the passing cars behaved exactly as they had a week ago. Only now, watching them, I saw that there were no drivers. 2 weeks had passed since I first ventured into the courtyard, and a question formed in my mind. What would happen if I tried to interrupt this routine? I checked my notes from the previous 2 weeks and came up with a plan. The next day at 9:13 and 3, the old lady was supposed to scold her cats for attacking the new kitten. I decided to knock on her door at that exact moment. Then she'd have to break character and react to me. That morning, I prepared myself. I even shaved for the first time in weeks. I positioned myself at her door early, watching the clock so I wouldn't miss the exact second. At precisely 9:13, I knocked quietly but clearly, trying not to sound aggressive. 3 seconds felt like an eternity, and a minute stretched into an hour. I was about to decide that this was enough to disrupt her schedule and turn to leave when a voice came from behind the door. "Who's there?" Just 3 words, but new ones, clearly spoken in response to my knock. But something about them was off, like they were stitched together from different phrases, with a distorted tone, hurriedly and clumsily trying to mimic natural speech. Before I could recover, the voice repeated, slightly smoother, but still unnatural. "Who's there?" I'm your neighbor from next door." I stammered, confused. And then the voice said it a third time. "Who's there?" as the door suddenly creaked open. I expected to see something horrifying, some monstrous humanoid ready to pounce on me from the darkness. But no, behind the door was only pitch-black darkness, as if the room was completely devoid of light. The door swung open, letting in a sliver of morning sunlight, and I saw an empty apartment. No movement, no signs of life, just a cold, oppressive atmosphere that filled me with unbearable despair. I had never felt loneliness so acutely as when I crossed that threshold. When I wheeled into the living room, there was nothing remarkable except for one thing. In the middle of the room, lying on its side, was an overturned wheelchair. Around it, I couldn't make out the details, but I heard slow, heavy squelching, crunching, and the occasional meow accompanying the sounds. I quickly left the apartment. After that day, everything became chaotic. The routines changed more frequently, unpredictably. Sometimes I wouldn't hear any sounds for days, then suddenly new phrases would repeat, ones I hadn't recorded. Cars drove and disappeared along different routes. It all felt like a desperate attempt to create the illusion of real life, but I knew it was just a hollow facade. That's when I started looking for a way out. By then, I hadn't seen a real person in almost a year and understood they were unlikely to appear on their own. I needed to escape, but where? I had no connections here, and I barely even remembered what city I was in. I tried to piece together what had happened after the accident. People in suits had come to me in the hospital, explained they'd handle everything, showed me a check and a contract. I signed the lease online. Then they took me straight to this complex. Had it been like this from the start? My thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Not the doorbell. 3 distinct knocks. I froze. As I wheeled to the door, I grabbed a large knife from the kitchen. "What? Who's there?" My voice trembled. No answer. Then I heard words stitched together from my own phrases being spoken on the other side. "I, your neighbor, from next door." I swung the door open, holding the knife in front of me. I saw no one, but I knew something was standing there. I started slashing wildly with the knife, and the same stitched-together voice spoke just inches from my face. "I'm your neighbor from next door." The air began to shimmer like heat waves, forming a distorted, human-like figure. It took a step forward, right toward me. This was my chance. I threw the knife straight at the trembling figure and realized that if steel could pass through it, so could I. I propelled myself forward in the wheelchair. As I crossed through the shimmering outline, it injected me with a freezing cold, more intense than anything I'd ever felt. It was as if the void itself was squeezing and paralyzing me from within, but I didn't let it consume me. If this was something real, I could break free. I raced toward the exit of the courtyard. Around me, dozens of distorted figures emerged, flickering silhouettes, trembling like heat waves over asphalt. They couldn't grab me physically, but every time their cold outlines passed through me, a numbing terror seeped into my bones. Thousands of hollow eyes stared at me with ravenous hunger. They chased me, and with each touch, fragments of voices echoed in my ears like a broken tape, warping and tearing, unable to form coherent words. Then, in a gap between the buildings, I saw it, the edge of the complex. No fences, no gates, no barriers. I summoned the last of my strength and pushed forward. Every ghost that passed through me left behind a void, but I didn't stop. And then I crossed the boundary. The pressure vanished. The air behind me turned thick, indifferent. I didn't dare look back. Ahead, a jogger with headphones, a rundown Dollar General, a homeless man at a bus stop. Real people. I burst into tears. Wheeling away, I stopped, shaking. Sweat soaked my clothes. Tears streaked my face. I didn't care how I looked. I just stared at them, grateful they existed. And then I turned around. Where the massive residential complex should have been, there was only an empty lot the size of a football field, an abandoned construction site, rusted excavators, piles of sand, a graffiti-covered porta-potty, and at the edge, a brand new sign. Coming soon, Whitlam-Hawthorne Research Facility.